Thank you for joining us here at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. My name is Asmara Askedom, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center. We're excited to host our guest speaker today, Mr. Chris Inglis. Mr. Inglis was the first U.S. National Cyber Director at the White House from 2021 to 2023. He was also an advisor to President Biden on cybersecurity issues. Prior to that appointment, he was the Deputy Director of the National Security Agency, NSA. Today, Mr. Inglis will provide a lecture called Transforming U.S. National Cyber Strategy for Threats and Opportunities Ahead. He'll provide key takeaways and insights from the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy, which was released a few months ago in March. He'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll turn to the audience for Q&A. So please get your questions ready. With that said, Mr. Inglis, it's a pleasure to welcome you to CGSR. Thanks so much for accepting our invitation, and I'll turn the floor over to you to get us started.
Great. Thanks very much for your kind welcome, Esmerette, and thank you to everyone that's on this session today. First, I think the standard kind of disclosures or disclaimers are in place. I, of course, am no longer at the White House, no longer represent the official position of the White House, or for that matter, any federal entity. But I'm largely informed by my work on both the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which was in play about 2019, 2021. By law was a group of people that were charged to figure out what the U.S. national strategy should be for cyber. One of the things that they did was to recommend that the U.S. have a national cyber director, a Senate-confirmed position at the White House, to largely pull the threads, the pieces together to create some degree of coherence, if not proactivity, on the part of the federal enterprise. I then was nominated for that and took that job in the early summer of 2021. Did that until February 23. I had promised to do three things, did them, and have turned the reins over to a considerably more capable, vigorous set of people who now populate the office of the National Cyber Director. What I'm going to describe today in what largely will look like a platform speech, but I'll be watching the chat session to see if I should adjust the discussion on the fly, are the foundational tenets of what was published in March of 2023 as the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy. I feel a little sheepish doing this. I read an article by Brandon Kirk-Williams not long ago, who was from Lawrence Livermore, who was in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and he nailed it. He kind of got what that strategy is all about pretty solidly, and I think teased out the seminal points. The strategy bangs on for pages and pages and pages, but Brandon got that pretty clear to dead on in about 2 or 3 pages, so well done to him. What I'm going to describe then is born of not just the strategy itself, but what I think the foundational truths are here. We live in an age where truth is hard to come by, hard to prove, but I'm going to try to elicit what I think are the things that we can all agree with as the conditions that exist in cyberspace, and then from that build out why the strategy looks the way it does. In your Q&A, I'm happy to take on any and all questions, and I'll give you as honest an answer as I can. I'm hoping that you can see the slides that I'm going through at this point. Kind of, if Asmerette, if you would sing out, or someone if you can't. But I've simply gone to a very straightforward, simple slide that says the why of cyber, because I think so often this is missed. I was, between my time at the National Security Agency, I graduated from there in 2014, and the time I came back into government formally in 2021, I did a lot of work in the private sector, and more than a few times, it was clear to me that companies who depend mightily on digital infrastructure, the internet plus, saw it not as a fundamental, essential foundation for their business, but as a cost center, or worse, a commodity in the corner that could be managed, wholly managed, by a silo of IT, information technology, or cyber professionals. That is, of course, not the case, but that's why I put this slide up. A fellow who actually started DEF CON and Black Hat, when he gets to this portion of his talk, he asks a wonderful question. He says, why do race cars have bigger brakes? It's Jeff Moss, of course, if you've heard him speak before. And he quickly answers that question before you kind of think that you're in the wrong place, the wrong talk. He answers, the reason that race cars have bigger brakes is so that they can go faster. There's an analog to that, pun intended, in cyberspace. The reason we have cyber, the reason we have digital infrastructure is not for bragging rights about the best technology. That might be a small piece of it, but it's so that we can do stuff, so that I can do my personal banking, so that I can manage my social calendar, so that if I was in business, I could reach markets that I can't physically get to, that I could coordinate supply chains or the application of services in ways that I couldn't physically realize those, kind of given the physical realities of the world. And increasingly, we deliver critical functions, critical services across digital infrastructure like electricity or elections, about which I'll say a little bit more in this talk, all because we depend on cyber. The reason I say that is that we shouldn't elevate cyber's priority in our kind of mind's eye. We shouldn't make it the most important thing ever, because we're not actually trying to build the best cyber or to defend cyber for its own sake. We're actually just trying to do the things we already care about. And therefore, I would subordinate cyber to those larger interests and make it clear to everybody that makes use of the internet, or cyberspace as I call it, you already care about this for reasons that have nothing to do with cyber for its own sake, but rather for the things you want to do with it. If you get to the proposition where you can convince people that they already care about it for reasons that are already in their priority stack, then you just might successfully make the case to them that they should invest more of their time and energy in ensuring that it meets their expectations. Which leads me to the next slide. I'll quickly go on to what I think the noun of cyberspace is. There's, of course, a discussion you can greatly complicate about all the dimensions of cyberspace, but I think it actually resolves to these three pieces. One is obvious, the technology in the lower left-hand corner. That's clearly a part of what I describe as cyberspace. Think of, when you close your eyes, all the things, all the tangible assets that are in this space, whether it's iPhones or desktop servers or routers or increasingly industrial capacity that is born of SCADA elements. All of that stuff, right, is the pacing function for what we know as the internet or cyberspace writ large. But at the top of this, I indicate that people are in cyberspace. They're not adjacent to it. They're not simply beleaguered or perplexed or vexed by it. They're in it. Why? Because their choices all day, every day, essentially dictate how this technology mass behaves. They dictate and forecast what cyber futures might be. I'll give an example or two of that as I get into this. I also indicate that doctrine, that's a fancy Department of Defense word, but roles and responsibility, the assignment of roles and responsibilities, that's in cyberspace, not merely something that is an afterthought or an implication of cyberspace, because the assignment of roles and responsibilities determines cyber present and future as much or more as the use of a particular technology. Again, I will give an example of that in a moment. But before I do, I would just like to say, if you buy that this is the noun of cyberspace, that you have to actually understand that these three things make contributions to how cyberspace plays out, whether it meets our expectations or not, then you cannot simply give time and attention to one of these dimensions, which is what we have in many cases done. We've kind of poured our heart and soul into technology. That is an appropriate investment. But we've not done much about making sure that the people component, or the assignment of roles and responsibilities, that's up to speed as well. And you have to get all three of these pieces right in order to get the sweet spot, what I indicate is the heart and soul of cyberspace, which is the intersection of those three. But there is, of course, one thing more. These three things, this kind of mass that we would call cyberspace, exists by design in the presence of adversaries. I'm often asked at the Naval Academy, where I teach cyber science, so why isn't cyber science just a proper subset of technology? First and foremost, it by design includes people and doctrine. The computer scientist might say, well, we think that too. But typically, a computer scientist doesn't think that what they do is practiced in the presence of an adversary. They will think about that in a bespoke manner, kind of in a case-by-case manner, but not in a consistent, continuous manner. Now, these adversaries, they are sometimes kind of natural elements, whether that's climate change or the occasional flood, kind of sweeping across an electric grid and perhaps holding at risk something that feeds, right, the cyber network. Sometimes it's kind of an animal other than a human being. A squirrel chewing into an electrical grid has been known to bring down massive kind of quantities of the stuff upon which cyber depends. That actually happened in Annapolis yesterday. Our electricity was out for 70,000 homes for about 4 hours. that ultimately has cyber cascading effects. And increasingly, this adversary that I'm mentioning here in this big red blob includes active human beings whose actions, whose decisions implicate cyber futures. Now, some of them are complacent people who actually have no malice in mind. They're simply not doing things that are wise, given how cyberspace actually works. They might be the ones clicking on those links in a phishing attack. They might be the ones who failed to configure a virtual private network properly. They might be CEOs who essentially have expedience, kind of say, we're going to let everyone bring their own device to the network tomorrow so that we don't have to provide company-provided technology without actually taking care of the risk that is inherent in that. They are, in fact, the kind of adversary that is implicit, sometimes benign, but nonetheless has a real and material effect. Most of us, I think, when you see the word adversary, thinking about the second kind of adversary, the ones that get up in the morning and want to deny, degrade, disrupt what we do. And of course, I include those in that red blob as well. But if I move on and think about what General Mike Hayden used to call the sins and the sinners, the kind of the what can go wrong attributed to the active elements of people who are doing something wrong in this space typically breaks out like this. There's still a large amount of crime in this space. About 84% by most estimates of the things that go wrong can be attributed to criminals who are attempting to hold you at risk for some financial or some material gain. About 15% of the things that go wrong are nation states. And you can think of the usual suspects here. I'm thinking of China, theft of intellectual property, Russia, kind of denial of service attacks, kind of their attacks on the Ukraine that sometimes spill over. I'm thinking North Korea, Iran, and maybe kind of groups that rise to the level of nation states that transcend somewhere between the criminal and the nation state element. And then, of course, there are the hacktivists out there. They come in at about 1%. All of these are real and material active kind of players in the space. What's interesting to me is when you look over the last 15 years at that crowd that I would describe as the 15%, this is the hit parade, a partial hit parade of what they've done over the last 15 years, starting with the massive intellectual property thefts in 2000, 2008. I would say we started to see that tail off in 2016. It does go on to this day, and so on and so forth, down through the notorious events WannaCry, NotPetya in 2017, the massive exploitation of the U.S. software supply chain SolarWinds in 20 and 21. And when I put the flags up, you'll recognize that the disproportionate, perhaps hugely impactful work of those 15%, the nation states, the flags are here on the left-hand side, are something that increasingly we cannot dismiss. This, of course, is a national security issue, but we care about it because everyone in this space actually kind of is falling prey to the criminals, the hacktivists, and the nation states. This set of threats that was reflected in this list was somewhat indiscriminate, certainly impactful, and very brazen. I'll kind of like circle in or kind of zero in on the WannaCry attacks and the NotPetya attacks in April of 2017 and June of 2017. If you were involved in that, WannaCry was attributable to the North Koreans, NotPetya attributable to the Russian nation states, not simply individuals within those nation states. WannaCry, if you woke up one morning and it failed to patch, your software, that eviscerated you. If you were the national health system in the United Kingdom, it went down and went down hard. NotPetya, if you were doing business with the Ukrainian government in June of 2017, and you were exchanging tax receipts on the fly, and you hadn't patched your system, then the deployment of malware by the Russians into the Ukrainian system came into your system, and you suffered that attack. I don't think the Russians intended to bring down Maersk, the shipping line worldwide, in that attack. I don't think they intended to bring down FedEx's European subsidiary in that attack, but they did. And if you were the U.S. Department of Defense in the summer of 2017, and you thought your way through how would I massively mobilize into Europe if I had to, fortunately we didn't have to that summer, you would have found it considerably more difficult because access to the commercial shipping lanes and access to FedEx, which is part of the civilian reserve air fleet for mobilization, was denied, right? They were out of business for weeks to months in each case. These are indiscriminate, brazen attacks that have a broad impact on not just national security interests, but increasingly civilian interest as well. Let me just give a context to talk about, I think, three lenses through which we can think about cyber attacks. All of this leads into what ultimately I'm going to suggest the national cybersecurity strategy attempts to address. If you think about a particular kind of one of those lines that I had up there on that chart I just took away, the Russians careening into our elections, a critical function that depends in some part on digital infrastructure. In the years 2016 through 2022, but I indicate on this charge 23 because it's not gone away. They're still out there, still attempting to do these things. They operated at three levels. These are the three lenses of cyber threat that I'm about to describe. At the first level, the Russians clearly were kind of trying to hold at risk the confidentiality, the integrity, the availability of data, and perhaps the performance of the systems that contain and process that data. We've known about that threat generally, not just attributable to Russians or criminals, but we've known about that threat for 40 years, maybe longer, since the dawn, right, of the original ARPANET or MILNET. We've known that that was an issue, and we know how to defend ourselves against that. We know how to actually deliver confidentiality protections, integrity protections, availability protections. And if that's all this was, the Russians in 2016 breaking into the Democratic National Committee's kind of servers and stealing John Podesta's 30,000 emails, this would be a problem easily solved. We can defend ourselves against that. We know what to do. But I don't think that's the game the Russians were playing in 2016 or 18 or 20 or 22 for that matter. They understood that those data, those systems, were actually abstracted into something more, the delivery of critical functions. Those abstractions of data, the use of those systems actually helps us aggregate and deliver critical services, whether that's healthcare, whether that's electrical power, whether that's the conduct of an election. That if you can hold the foundations at risk, the data, the software, the hardware, you can then hold the critical functions dependent upon that at risk. The reason that abstraction is important is that if you're going to defend just data, software, hardware, well, you can do what we've known to do for 40 or 50 years, right? You know how to protect confidentiality, integrity, availability. But if you're going to defend the delivery of critical functions, you have to do something more. You have to actually figure out how are those delivered in our society, typically through a collaboration across private sector and public sector elements. And you have to defend not just the data and the hardware, you now have to defend the collaboration, which is why after our experience in 2016, there's a lot of work done by governments, federal, state, local, to essentially form collaborative endeavors to try to then at once understand what the common hazard was of foreign governments attempting to hold our election system at risk, array our various resources in a collaborative fashion to address those common hazards so that being crowdsourced by an adversary, we could respond in kind with a collaboration. The only way to beat a crowdsourcing adversary is to crowdsource in reverse, to make them beat all of us, to beat one of us. That is not self-evident if you only think about the first layer of this model. But the Russians, of course, weren't simply after the election system, in my view. I think they were after something more. The Russians were playing at the third level, which is to attack our confidence. If they could make us doubt whether an election in 16, 18, 20, and so on and so forth was not delivering the fair result, was not delivering the correct result, that they could make us believe that, they could hold something greater at risk, which is the confidence that this society can depend upon a free and open internet, or that this society can depend upon democratic principles going forward. And I think that you have folks at Lawrence Livermore, National Laboratories, do a really good job of considering and describing what the Russian national security strategy might be and how they think of that. I think they operate at this level, and they merely use the first two levels as the means by which they can hold it at risk. If you're going to defend confidence, you have to do something more than you've done at the first two levels. And I would ask you for the moment to hold that thought, because I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. So what's to be done? If I've laid out why we care about cyber, what it is, who's doing it, what in the world are you going to do about this to make sure that you can meet your positive aspirations in the use of cyber? About a year and a quarter ago, February of 2021, I and a fellow named Harry Kresha, operating out of the Office of the National Cyber Director, wrote this article in the Foreign Affairs Journal, which at the time was taken as a somewhat heretical kind of treatise, which said that we should not obsess about threats in cyberspace. We should rather obsess about our positive aspirations in cyberspace. Get back on track and consider, what do we want to do with cyberspace, so that we might then realize our positive aspirations. And if we essentially have that focus, we can then begin to kind of take some actions that make it such that we have greater confidence that cyberspace will do for us what we want it to do, what we need it to do, as opposed to we wake up in the morning and obsess about who's holding us at risk and how do we, in a fetal crouch, kind of defend ourselves in that. This is the beginnings of what you would do if you believe that if it's worth making the investments in this so that it realizes your positive aspirations, you would do something along these lines. You would create defensible systems. And again, not just in the technology, but in the skills that our people bring to bear and in the assignment of roles and responsibilities. You would actually defend the system, because no system can be made perfectly secure. You all know that better than I might, but no system can be perfectly secure. It can be made defensible. It must then be defended, right? And so you have to actually defend the system. That's where collaboration and the concurrent application of multiple disciplines, capabilities, authorities comes in. We have for a very long period of time been defending in silos, where you defend your patch, I'll defend my patch, pretending, as it were, that we're essentially solving similar but not the same problem. That's nonsense. We're solving the same problem. We're up against the same adversaries, and we often share. We don't have similar instances of a particular technology. We're sharing a certain technology. The third piece of this is to prepare for kind of the negative kind of aspects of what might or might not happen to you, so that you're prepared with branches and sequels and the traditional national security doctrine, but you're prepared with options and alternatives of what they're going to do to essentially motor your way through that. I'll pause at this point just to say that if I were to go back to this strategy, or this kind of this look at it, there was a really nice article written by a guy named Reed Standish about 5 years ago, where he asked the following question. He said, why are the Finns, the Finnish government, not worried about the Russians careening into their election the way the Americans are, again, in the even years of our nation's history? And he answered the question quickly by saying, it's not because the Russians aren't trying to hold the Finns at risk in the way they're trying to hold the Americans at risk. It's because the Finns have three things on side that we might not have in ample measure. First things that the Finns do is they have a joined up government. This isn't a political statement. I'm just observing that there's quite a bit of divisive rhetoric taking place in the United States now. The Finns don't have that kind of that degree of a challenge. They have a government that essentially is more of a parliamentary government. It's joined up. When the government decides what it wants to do, it essentially then puts out its statement, works hard to reconcile that with the kind of aspirations of its constituents, its citizens, and they essentially have forward motion in the execution of that strategy. Two, the Finns place a premium on critical thinking skills. If you're a student in one of their schools, you're not allowed to simply recite somebody else's views. You have to give an account of the facts, the convenient ones, the inconvenient ones, so that you can actually think your way through troubled landscapes where it doesn't necessarily align with your view of what the right answer is. You can work your way through even kind of, uncertain circumstances. And three, they get a lot of experience with the Russians, such that if you're a Russian, and those three things are true about the Finns, one, you got to catch up to the Finns. They're not kind of stuck still waiting to be kind of taken apart. Two, you got to get past critical thinkers, not an easy thing to do. And three, you got to look like something other than a Russian. That first point where you got to catch up to the Finns in order to take advantage of them is really the basis of we should have positive aspirations about cyberspace. Like Jim Mattis once said, he didn't lie awake at night kind of troubled by the actions of others. He once said that he makes other people lie awake at night because he's moving forward. He's got very positive, kind of very proactive aspirations, and he forces other people to react to him. I can overstate the point, but it's impossible to understate it. All stakeholders own this. This is about resilience, whether it's an organization in the government, the private sector, or academia. It's not a cyber tax. It's not something in the corner. So I'm going to get then into in the next two slides. So what then do we do to take advantage of this and incorporate this in what ultimately became the National Cybersecurity Strategy in March of this year? First, if you believe what I said on the previous slide, which actually looks a lot like deterrence theory, make yourself a hard target, be proactive, right, in understanding what others are doing, and interdict them at the earliest possible moment. But if you believe that, then these are the elements of that that are implicit that today in cyberspace are not widely practiced. We do not make digital infrastructure defendable, right? I'm about to publish an op-ed that says that we should think of cyber resilience, inherent cyber resilience, the way we think about transportation inherent resilience. We do not independently, as users of automobiles, kind of try to do the design and engineering of air safety bags or seat belts, or for that matter, the road systems on which we drive those cars. That's done at a time and place where you have the leverage and the scope and scale to build inherent resilience and robustness in. Now, having said that, the users of cars or the pilots of airplanes have to participate in their own defense. They have to actually take a defensible piece of infrastructure and use it properly so that they are participating in the safe operation, the safe execution of that. But these first two tenets say that we need to move the responsibility today that is almost always borne by the end user or the operator. That's even where most regulation is focused, on the end user and the operator, and move it back up the supply chain, back up the ecosystem to those places where this technology is born, where the innovation to create the primary capabilities that we're so familiar with, whether that's kind of the performance, whether that's the user presentation, whether that's the integration, whether that's the speed, and marry that with inherent resilience and robustness. If we do that on line one, then on line two, users can then participate in their own defense, and we can do that in an increasingly collaborative fashion. That's line three, a bias for collaboration so that we make them beat all of us to be one of us. And then in line four, align actions to consequences. If you behave badly in this space, there should be a consequence, not necessarily a cyber consequence. We can use legal remedies, we can use public shaming, we can use diplomatic remedies operating through, by, with, and through other countries. We can use financial sanctions, but we should think our way through all of that. And if you behave well in this space, you deserve the material assistance and support, not just of your friends in whatever sector you might live in or your company, but the government should show up and not find and stab the wounded. Now, I would say that this strategy is actually a strategy we're seeing in real time executed by the Ukrainians. I would say that the Ukrainian digital infrastructure is probably not what you'd want to go to war with. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's insufficient to the task of defending themselves against a pretty staunch Russian kind of attack in cyberspace as much or more is in physical space, but it's not perfect. And it has all sorts of kind of weaknesses, all sorts of failure to make the investments over a 10 to 15-year period that you would prefer if you were actually going to go to this dance. And yet that architecture is defendable. Why? Because it has sufficient agility in it that you can move analytics, you can move storage from one place to another so that you can bob and weave in the presence of an assault made in cyberspace so much more is on the field of battle. They actually defend that digital infrastructure kind of in the Ukrainian kind of case. They have shown that while technology matters, their expertise matters more. And ironically, the Ukrainian defenders have been trained over the last 9 years by the Russians who come at them almost every day, right, in cyberspace. And therefore, the Ukrainians are, as a byproduct of that, pretty good at cyber defense. But on point three, the Ukrainians have forged a collaboration between themselves, Microsoft, ESET, Cisco, even Elon Musk, and the contribution of kind of Starlink terminals, right, an out-of-band communication system that doesn't depend upon in-band cyber capabilities. So the Russians are now vexed because they have to beat many parties to beat the one that they're after. And of course, the last part of the strategy, aligning actions to consequences, that's probably something that's happening to some degree. But the first three pieces of this, you can say the Ukrainians have demonstrated to it fairly well. So I've made this case before. I just want to kind of foot stomp this, which is what I'm talking about is bringing to bear the authorities, the talents, the skills of not just the individuals who are on the front lines of cyberspace, not just private sector organizations where most of the innovation, deployment, sustainment, defense of cyberspace occurs, but governments, especially governments, such that if we bring all those together, whole of society approach, some degree of kind of interdependency between these efforts, apply that concurrently, you'd have to beat all of us to beat one of us. Now, you can say this positively. You can simply turn this around to say, each of us can and should contribute to the defense of all of us, or all of us can come to the aid of any of us. I don't care which way you say that, but we have to break down the silos that make it such today. We can be picked off one at a time, not realizing that the threat that just beat me is the same threat that you're struggling with in your stovepipe, in your silo, and that isn't going to work. We've actually begun to give some kind of realization to that here in the United States. Those of you familiar with what Jen Easterly is doing in the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, it's called the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. Forget the acronym, just think of the thought, which is that they have subject matter experts from the private sector and the public sector standing side by side, sometimes physically, mostly virtually, trying to figure out if something that one party sees is actually of use to another party in that space. You would have heard probably about 6 months ago, if you paid close attention to this, there was a day when Microsoft woke up one day and said, we think there's the possibility of a wiper virus. That's a bad thing. A wiper virus coming across the near horizon. We might assume, kind of for purposes of this discussion, from Russia, that would affect the Ukrainian digital infrastructure, the Microsoft architecture within the Ukraine. So we have diagnosed that wiper virus. We've devised a patch for that wiper virus. We've deployed that patch to the wiper virus, not just to Ukrainian customers, but to all of our customers worldwide. Problem solved. A problem that never occurred was solved before it occurred. That is an instance of somebody had knowledge about the existence of that, shared that with another party who could do something about that. And now you find you have to beat many of us, if not all of us, to beat one of us. And the game isn't to react well. The game is to actually be sufficiently kind of forward leaning that a problem doesn't occur that otherwise would. So what's that look like in kind of a national cybersecurity strategy? There are two big changes kind of in this strategy that perhaps building on the success of the past, no one administration kind of generates a strategy, though it might be authored by a particular administration. So I would have to give credit for all that came before. But the two big new things in this strategy, and I think that in Brandon Kirk, Williams' article, he got this right, he pointed this out, is one, we need to rebalance responsibility, generate a new social contract for responsibility of resilience in cyberspace, assigning that responsibility to those who can, only those who can bear it. Again, if I buy a car from Honda Motor Corporation, I am not independently responsible as the user to go buy the air safety bag or the seat belt or the anti-lock brakes. They do that for me because only they can do that at the scope and scale that's required across our society. And the road systems on which that will then drive have to be similarly designed so that the system within which these devices operates has the same degree of inherent resilience. So think cloud architecture. And there's some degree of governance on those systems. Think about removing drunk drivers or kind of, policing speeders from that road. Let's make sure that those who can and should bear that responsibility do so with the lightest possible touch, but no lighter. Two, if we believe in that, we then need to incentivize resilience by design, so that we don't practice a strategy that says, I'll make this a pickup game. I am willing to make the investments necessary to remove threats from the system or to perhaps remove vulnerabilities from the system, but I'm not willing to think my way through how I can actually design a more resilient, more robust system in the first place. We need to get to a place where we actually conceive of this and do this upfront. I was a mechanical engineer in my first academic life. That was 45 years ago. I had a slide rule and I used it. If at that moment in time I had been actually charged to build and deploy systems of interest, I could have, I wouldn't, but I could have built systems that did something of interest and spewed toxins into the adjacent river. That would not have been my problem, though I might have been kind of, even in the time, morally kind of troubled by that. But it wouldn't have been my problem, that it wasn't somebody else's to clean up. That's no longer the case. We've now invested a sufficient amount of ethical training, social responsibility training into the early formative moments of our engineering students so they understand what their ecological responsibilities are, their ethical responsibilities. We need to do the same thing, quite frankly, for coders and hardware designers and so on and so forth, so that they understand what their responsibilities are, resilience by design. And then finally, employ all these instruments of power coherently, concurrently, and proactively. Now, there is a strategy. It's on the street. You can read the long version if you want, but here's the short version. The strategy has 5 pillars in it. Now, there are any number of ways you can organize a strategy. This is one, but I think it's a useful one. First, it actually focuses on critical infrastructure, which is a common resource for everyone in our society and frankly across national boundaries. And we want to give people who use it confidence that it is available for them, resilient for them, that it will work, it'll be reliable when they want it to work. This is about more than simply finding and removing the bad actors, which is what line 2 says. This is about the incentivization of resilience by design and the creation of a set of responsibilities that says there are certain parties who simply need to bear that responsibility. Part 2 then says we will, in fact, align actions to consequences. We'll go after malicious cyber actors, but it's line 2 for a reason. We're not going to shoot our way out of this. So you got to do part 1 before you consider part 2. Part 3 is we're going to use market forces to drive security and resilience to incentivize the actors, the principal actors in the system to invest resilience and robustness. We will at some point likely, almost certainly, have to regulate some of those parties, but we'll do so after market forces, after self-enlightenment and market forces have their sway. For those of you who were paying attention in the 1960s, some of you were here then, you would have seen Volvo in the late 60s and the early 70s start to have advertisements where they would crash cars into walls. It was a little bit off-putting if you were a car driver in the day, but the reason they did that was the moment that market forces entered the fray in terms of automobile safety. We need to let that play out in cyber as well, which is to let vendors compete on the basis of arguing or offering good cyber resilience and robustness. And we are seeing some of that. But market forces alone will be insufficient. We found any number of instances where market forces alone create bubbles or perhaps have blind spots. So there will be some degree of regulation in this space. I'm happy to take a question or two on that. 4, invest in a resilient future. And this, if you read the tagline on this, is really where we double down and say it's about more than technology, right? It needs to be on the relationships between the various parties and certainly on the people who populate cyber systems, not just the workforce that has IT or cyber in their name, but anyone whose choices implicate cyber futures. And then 5, very, very, very important, international partnerships so that we can pursue and leverage, right, their capabilities, our capabilities to achieve a multiplicative, greater than the sum of its parts approach. So the government has to get in the game. The government in this strategy actually takes on some greater responsibility, but that's meant to be a down payment on what we then hope will elicit and incentivize the private sector and governments below to do their bit. I won't say any more about this, but rather use this as my last slide. I think that we need to be humble about cyberspace. I may not have spoken in the last 35 minutes in the way that sounds humble, but we need to be humble about that, to say that cyber, even kind of the proper investment of time and energy, can only deliver so much. And that earlier strategy, or that earlier model I showed you about what cyber might hold at risk, remember layer 1 was the computers, the hardware, the software. Layer 2 was the critical functions dependent upon that, the abstraction of those critical functions. Layer 3 is confidence. Cyber can hold all 3 of those at risk. And I gave an example of the Russians. But frankly, the delivery of confidence to the extent that a free and open society needs it is not going to be delivered by cyber. It will be enabled by cyber. Cyber might be the platform on which that free and open discourse takes place, but that's going to require some strategy, some kind of critical will, national will. That's going to require something more. Cyber's job is to provide the foundation on which that might take place, but we're going to, as a society, have to do more in order to sustain the confidence that we want, that we need as a free and open society going forward. We're not going to solve that layer 3 by simply knocking down the other fellow's idea or deploying a digital infrastructure that is inherently resilient and robust. It's what we do with it on top of that that will make the difference. I think that really is my last slide. I'm right at about 42 minutes, and so we've got some time for your questions and answers. And so I'm going to stop presenting and take whatever questions you have, and I'd be happy to answer those as candidly as I might.